Picture this, a high-stakes presidential race between a far-right candidate and a liberal. All the polls predict that the right-winger will lose badly. It looks like the lefty has a clear shot at victory, an easy victory. But on election day, the conservative shocks everyone with a much better than anticipated performance. It turns out the polls were wrong. And no, I'm not talking about Trump versus Hillary in 2016 or even Trump versus Joe Biden in 2020. This just happened on Sunday in Brazil. Former leftist President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was expected to receive 50% of the votes. The majority needed to win the election's first round outright. But sitting authoritarian President Jair Bolsonaro swooped in, clinching enough votes to force a runoff at the end of the month. As of Monday, da Silva led by 5 points at 48%, and Bolsonaro took 43%, even though the polls had showed Bolsonaro struggling and much further behind than that. You might remember Bolsonaro by his nickname, the Trump of the tropics. He rose to power on an anti-establishment platform, bashing political correctness and the rotten media elites. Bolsonaro has already been circulating baseless conspiracies about the election results, laying the groundwork for his own big lie in case of a loss. He's a self-described homophobe who has used gay slurs and has said he'd rather have his son be dead than gay. He also denigrates women, telling a female representative in Congress, "I'm not going to rape you because you're very ugly." Yeah. The election could also determine the fate of the Amazon. Deforestation has surged under Bolsonaro, who, surprise, surprise, is a climate change denier too. And he's since changed his tune, but Bolsonaro initially spoke out against lockdowns, masks, and yes, vaccines. That's who he is. So sure, Bolsonaro still has an uphill climb to re-election. He's still finished 5 points behind his opponent, but his stronger than expected performance is especially shocking, considering that his opponent, da Silva, was once labeled the most popular politician on earth by one Barack Obama. Da Silva, better known as Lula, is a former union leader who served as Brazil's president from 2003 to 2010. He was hailed for lifting millions out of poverty. But 3 years ago, he was in prison after being sentenced to a 22-year term for political corruption. Lula only ended up serving 580 days because Brazil's Supreme Court found that he was not tried according to proper jurisdiction and threw out the convictions. Lula has maintained that the charges were false. Brazil is Latin America's biggest democracy. It's the fourth biggest democracy on the planet. This election there matters. It matters that Bolsonaro and the far right are doing so well in Brazil. It matters that Giorgia Meloni, another far-right leader, is on course to become the Prime Minister of Italy. What some would call the neo-fascist movement is frighteningly global. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to this guy.
People of Brazil, you have a great opportunity to re-elect a fantastic leader, a fantastic man, one of the great presidents of any country in the world, President Bolsonaro. He's done an absolutely incredible job with your economy, with your country. He's respected by everybody all throughout the world. So I strongly endorse President Bolsonaro. He will be your leader for hopefully a long time. He has taken your country to great heights. And again, your country is now respected because of him all over the world. So go out and vote for Bolsonaro.
Well, that's all nonsense, of course, but the bigger picture is this. They're rooting for each other. They're not hiding the fact that they see themselves as a global authoritarian coalition. So fascism, sadly, isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And one thing we've learned the hard way from both America and Brazil is don't believe the polls that tell you otherwise. To help us understand what's happening in Brazil, let's turn now to James Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University. As president of the Board of Brazil office, he's now in Sao Paulo, hosting that organization's coverage of the presidential election. Thank you so much for being here. How big of a surprise was it that Lula did not get a majority of the vote in the first round, as the polls predicted? Were you surprised?
I was not surprised that he didn't win outright. It was a close call. The question, I think, was the larger amount of support that Bolsonaro got in the first round. We didn't expect that.
And the question that was asked here after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 was, how did this happen? Why did the polls in Brazil get it so wrong?
So the polls got it right for Lula. They predicted he would get 48 to 52% of the votes with a 2% margin of error. So they were right. The final prediction was 50, so they were right there. The question is the underreported results of the support for Bolsonaro, and we're not really sure why that is. It could be because there has not been a census in recent years, that there are projections of the weight of different parts of the electorate was disproportionately balanced in Lula's favor and didn't capture the actual support of the Bolsonaro supporters in the country. It also could be that people who support Bolsonaro just don't talk to the pollsters or don't tell them the truth.
Yeah. So let's talk about Bolsonaro himself. He's been called the Trump of the tropics, the Trump of Brazil many times. We just saw the footage of Trump endorsing him over the weekend. So are we reading too much here in America into these parallels between the Brazilian election and what we've experienced in the U.S., what we're going to experience in the U.S., or is this an apt comparison?
It's a very apt comparison, and I do it all the time. I think that the Bolsonaro government has followed Trump's playbook a lot in many, many similar ways, including, as you mentioned, the COVID crisis, but also the questioning of the election results and the possibility that if, in fact, he loses in the runoff on the 30th of October, that he might really challenge the election results.
And if he does that, I mean, we've talked about challenges to an election result here in the US. We saw that insurrection on January the 6th. Luckily, it didn't go beyond that. We're worried now about 2024, as I discussed earlier in the show. But if he loses, unlike 2024, where Trump is the challenger, he won't be in control of the government, what can Bolsonaro do to muddy the waters, even to incite violence, as the sitting/outgoing president if he loses at the end of this month?
So he has been soliciting very carefully the support of the armed forces, the militarized police, and illegal militia forces that are strong, especially in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Fortunately, the Biden administration and leaders in Europe have made it very clear that they believe in the electoral system in Brazil. They believe in the process. They want to see free and fair elections. And if, in fact, Bolsonaro loses the election and does call on the military to resort to violence or mobilize his supporters, the United States administration has said very clearly they wouldn't recognize the results, that they do not want to see a military coup in Brazil.
So turning from Bolsonaro to the left candidate in this race, the person who's leading in this race, former President Lula, who only 3 years ago was in prison on a political corruption conviction that he has always disputed. How do we put that into context, that he's out of prison, this former president, and he's on course, if the polls are to be believed and if this first round result is to be believed, on course to winning the presidency again? Put that in context for us, please.
So there's two important elements. The first other one is that the prosecuting attorney and the judge overseeing the case that led to his conviction and therefore what made him illegal to run in the elections in 2018, later was charged by the Supreme Court as having been involved in collusion between the judge and the prosecuting attorney, which is one of the elements which tarnish the effectiveness of the case. But more specifically, Lula is extremely popular. He left office, as you pointed out, with 87% approval. He carried out many significant social changes in the country that elevated the standard of living of the poorest, expanded the educational system, free college tuition for people of African and indigenous descent through government programs. He's been really very popular in his social programs, and I think that overcomes and trumps, as it were, any charges or residual charges for his supporters about alleged corruption. Now, the anti-Lula forces very much see him as a corrupt politician, therefore do not want him in office, but his supporters are very loyal to him and what he has done for the country.
So going back to the big picture comparison between the two countries, one last question for you. What can the American public, what can the American media, what can the Democratic Party here in the United States, what can they take away, what can they learn from this Brazilian presidential election where Bolsonaro is running again for a second term, as we anticipate Trump will do, assuming he's a free man, run again for a second term in 2024?
So I think we can see, first of all, that very conservative forces use election systems and the legal systems to subvert them. And this is a part of the erosion of democracy. And secondly, that what's going on in the United States and Brazil is part of a larger world phenomenon of liberal governments carrying out these policies and really challenging the longevity and the life of democracies.